Molly, can I just remind you what the Prime Minister said back in August 2020? I think you may know this, but let's just, for our listeners, let's just listen to this clip.
But not in the classroom, because that's clearly nonsensical. You can't teach with face coverings, and you can't expect people to learn with face coverings.
There we are. You can't expect people to learn with face coverings. And yet, what are they doing this week, Molly?
It's unbelievable, isn't it? It's an absolute disgrace, because I think the thing here is we have a bunch of adults who know that this is potentially and harmful. You know, at the very least, we know it significantly impedes communication, and what is education if not communication? And yet they're doing it anyway. And I think if we just pause to think, you know, big picture, where are we in the course of this pandemic? Well, we have a virus which thankfully looks to be relatively mild for the vast majority of adults and harmless for the vast majority of children. We have children who have been tested like guinea pigs obsessively on going back to school, so they shouldn't have this virus anyway. A fair few of them have been vaccinated, supposedly to, you know, save their education, which we are now further impeding. And, you know, where does this end? Why are we doing this? And of course, we have adults who the vast majority of school populations will have been triple vaccinated, which is great. But why do we need this? And what do we think we're going to achieve by it?
I mean, I just find it extraordinary. I suppose looking at it from, so what? Let's try and imagine what the unions, who obviously are quite powerful, some of the unions who've been, I guess, trying to persuade this course of action with the Department of Education. What have they been saying? They've been saying, well, we need it in order to protect staff so that there's not a staff shortage, because if there's a staff shortage, then you can't provide the supervision, so all the children have got to go home again. What are your thoughts to that line of argument?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think we are far beyond the point now of needing children or requiring children to protect adults. I think that is actually frankly disgraceful and really very uncomfortable, I think, for a lot of adults at this point. It's very clear that children have already borne a disproportionate burden. I think just on its own terms, though, that argument fails, because we know by comparison with countries like Scotland, where sadly children have been masked in lessons throughout, and actually Scotland have higher case rates than us. So we know that this measure is not even, you know, likely to work on its own terms. And of course, the other thing we know here is that no in-school studies of the effectiveness of the measure have actually been done. And of course, we know that, you know, this measure is harmful. Unfortunately, it looks like no adequate harm assessment of the measure was done. But this is a disproportionate... Sorry, Richard, yeah.
That in itself feels almost feels negligent that this time last year that the Department of Education didn't carry out a proper, in a sense, randomised trial comparing classes with children wearing masks and the opposite, with not wearing masks, to give some proper evidence. I mean, it's the former president of the Royal College of Paediatrics, Professor Russell Viner, I think it is. He said that there's no evidence that masks make any difference because they haven't done that work.
No, exactly. And I mean, I think negligent is probably letting people off lightly at this point. I think imposing this kind of measure on children, you know, in the very height of a pandemic that was harmful to children, might be morally justified. I think doing so at a time when children, and the vast majority of adults, thankfully, are not in danger, but we either know this measure harms children or we are refusing to look at the evidence, which has been there for a year. So when we threatened DofE with legal action back in April 21, we sent them a pack which was harms of mask wearing for children. And annexed to that pack was a whole bunch of peer-reviewed studies. So the evidence is there. It has always been there. If the evidence hasn't been read, then that, as you say, is negligent, or worse than negligent, actually. It's reckless if this is harming children.
I mean, it just seems extraordinary because normally there's always, in government departments, when they introduce something significant, they do some form of cost-benefit analysis to look at the consequences of a new course of action. This is a really significant course of action affecting the education and indeed health and anxiety of children. and yet they don't seem to have done that work. I mean, it beggars belief, actually. It's hard to believe that it's true, but it clearly is.
It is hard to believe it's true, and I think it's unforgivable. It's unthinkable we're here, actually. And of course, we know why we're here. We're here because, as you said, Richard, teaching unions have been baying for school closures. So we have this very uncomfortable false transaction set up that, it's either kids in school with masks or it's no school. But of course, we only have to look at what's happening in the adult world, where we're, mixing in restaurants and pubs, and what was everyone doing on New Year's Eve? Of course, it's not no school or kids in masks at school. That should never be a transaction. And
that's right. And here we are. We're lots of people are going back to their offices this week after a long festive period, and they're not going to be wearing masks in offices. They're not going to be wearing masks when you go to a pub or a restaurant. But the government is forcing the very group of people who are at the very least risk from this virus, mercifully, because they're our future, they're at the very least risk, and yet they're forcing the greatest imposition of suffering wearing masks. It's not just corridors in between lessons. No. It's 6, 7, 7.5 hours a day.
Yeah, it's absolutely abhorrent. And actually, I think, if you take heart from anything, actually, the reaction among, much of the adult community, but actually, as far as I can see, among many teachers as well, has actually been pretty appalled by this. And I think, the good news is that this is guidance. It is open to any parent who is uncomfortable to this to simply exempt your child. The UsForThem website has very simple template letters. You're not going to be breaking the law. You're well within your rights to do that. And parents should do that now, as too should teachers, actually, because we keep hearing from, we've heard from so many teachers over the last however long it's been, 36.
That's a key point then. What that really requires, I suspect, is it requires brave heads to say to the teachers, this is what I think we should do in our school, that we should not require masks. And it's not easy. It requires leadership and courage. But are you hearing from your parents or anyone that is going on anywhere?
Yeah, I mean, we have seen a few examples, and there've been a few on social media as well, of teachers and heads actually who have said, actually, we are uncomfortable with this and we're not going to do it. And that, and it is wonderful to see, because my sense is that whatever you think about wearing masks as an adult, there will be a great many adults who are, as they should be, deeply uncomfortable about requiring children to wear masks for 7 hours a day at a point when the vast majority of adults are not required to do it. It's just wrong.
Well, hopefully also there are more children like Ash, the tweet you may have heard just before, Ash, who's tweeted in, he's 16 and he refuses to wear a mask in school. We can't keep wearing them. We can't focus whilst freezing in classrooms. Fascinating. Molly, we could go on forever, but time is against us. Thank you so much